March 1799. The fortress of Acre on the coast of Ottoman Syria. Napoleon Bonaparte, conqueror of Italy, master of Egypt, the unstoppable military genius who'd never lost a campaign, stared at the walls of a small coastal fortress and realised he might have finally met his match. Not from another general, not from a massive army, but from a British naval officer who turned those walls into an impregnable barrier that would break Napoleon's dreams of conquering the East. For 2 months, Napoleon's veterans would hurl themselves at Acre's defences. French artillery would pound the walls day and night. Mining operations would attempt to blow breaches. Elite assault columns would charge into desperate close-quarters fighting. But every attack failed. Every breach was sealed. Every French advance was thrown back by a stubborn defence led by a man Napoleon would later call the architect of his greatest frustration. This is the story of the Siege of Acre, the battle where British naval power defeated French military genius, the defence that ended Napoleon's eastern ambitions, and the 2-month struggle that proved even the greatest general in Europe could be stopped by British determination, ingenuity, and Sir Sidney Smith's tactical brilliance. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're covering the siege that broke Napoleon's momentum, the desperate defence where British sailors, Turkish soldiers, and one brilliant naval officer denied France control of the Middle East. But before we get to those walls of Acre, before we watch Napoleon's veterans break themselves against British-directed defences, we need to understand how Napoleon ended up besieging a fortress in Syria and why this small port city mattered so much to his grand strategy. And if you're enjoying this, subscribe. We cover the battles where British forces stopped the world's greatest threats, the victories won through determination, tactical genius, and refusal to surrender against impossible odds. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign began in 1798 with grand ambitions. France couldn't challenge British naval supremacy directly. Admiral Nelson had proven that at the Battle of the Nile, but Napoleon believed he could strike at British interests indirectly by conquering Egypt and threatening British India. He imagined himself following Alexander the Great's path, conquering Egypt, then Syria, then Persia, eventually marching into India to destroy Britain's most valuable possession. It was a romantic, ambitious vision that appealed to Napoleon's sense of destiny. The conquest of Egypt itself went relatively well. French forces landed successfully, defeated Mamluk armies at the Battle of the Pyramids, and occupied Cairo. Napoleon established French administration and began presenting himself as a liberator, freeing Egyptians from Mamluk oppression. But Nelson's destruction of the French fleet at Aboukir Bay changed everything. Without naval supremacy, Napoleon's army was trapped in Egypt. No reinforcements could arrive, no supplies could be shipped safely, and British naval forces could support anti-French resistance throughout the eastern Mediterranean. By early 1799, Napoleon faced multiple problems. His army in Egypt was isolated. Ottoman Turkey had declared war on France and was preparing to invade Egypt from Syria. Local resistance was growing. Napoleon needed a military success to restore momentum and intimidate his enemies. So he decided on a bold move. He would invade Syria, defeat Ottoman forces gathering there, and capture key cities along the coast. A successful Syrian campaign would secure Egypt's flank, demonstrate French invincibility, and perhaps open the route toward further eastern conquests. Napoleon marched north from Egypt in February 1799 with about 13,000 men, a relatively small force, but Napoleon believed French military superiority would compensate for limited numbers. His soldiers were veterans of the Italian and Egyptian campaigns. They'd won victories against larger forces before. They trusted Napoleon completely, and they expected another triumphant campaign. The invasion started well. French forces captured Gaza easily. They took Jaffa after a brief siege, though Napoleon's decision to massacre the garrison there would later haunt his reputation. Ottoman forces retreated before the French advance. By mid-March, Napoleon's army reached Acre, the last major fortress before the open plains of Syria. Napoleon expected Acre to fall quickly, just another fortress to be stormed, another garrison to be defeated. He had no idea what awaited him there. Acre was an ancient port city, strategically important because it controlled the coastal road from Egypt to Syria. The fortress itself wasn't particularly impressive, medieval walls that had been partially modernised, overlooking a small harbour. The Ottoman garrison numbered only a few thousand men under Ahmed Pasha, known as Al-Jazar, or the Butcher, for his harsh reputation. On paper, Acre should have fallen easily to French assault, but Acre had something Napoleon didn't expect: Sir Sidney Smith. Commodore Sir William Sidney Smith was one of the Royal Navy's most remarkable officers. He was 45 years old in 1799 and had already packed several careers' worth of adventures into his life. He'd served in the American Revolutionary War as a teenager. He'd fought at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. He'd conducted intelligence operations in France before the Revolution. He'd been captured by French forces and imprisoned in Paris, only to escape in 1798 with help from French royalists. He spoke perfect French, understood French military methods intimately, and possessed both tactical brilliance and absolute confidence in British naval superiority. Smith arrived at Acre in mid-March aboard HMS Tigre, just days before Napoleon's army reached the fortress. He immediately grasped the strategic situation. If Acre fell, Napoleon would control the Syrian coast and might indeed march eastward. But if Acre held, Napoleon's campaign would stall. The fortress would tie down French forces, consume French resources, and demonstrate that Napoleon wasn't invincible. Smith decided Acre would not fall. Smith brought more than just British ships to Acre's defence. He brought naval guns, heavy cannons that could outrange French field artillery. He brought sailors trained in gunnery who could direct defensive fire with professional precision. He brought military engineers who could repair breaches and strengthen fortifications. He brought supplies that could sustain a garrison through a long siege. And he brought captured French siege artillery, guns Napoleon had shipped by sea for the siege, intercepted by British vessels before they could reach the French army. Napoleon would literally be facing his own guns turned against him. Smith also brought organisational genius to Acre's defence. He didn't simply support the Ottoman garrison. He essentially took command of the defence, coordinating Ottoman soldiers, British sailors, and local defenders into an effective fighting force. He positioned naval guns on the walls where they could sweep French approaches. He organised work parties to repair damage from French bombardment. He established supply lines using British ships to bring ammunition and provisions. He created a defence that could sustain itself through repeated assaults. Napoleon began the siege with confidence. French artillery opened fire on March 20th, pounding Acre's walls from positions outside musket range. Napoleon expected the walls to crumble under sustained bombardment, creating breaches his infantry could storm. This was standard siege warfare: reduce the fortifications with artillery, then assault. Napoleon had done it successfully at Jaffa weeks earlier, but Acre's defence was different. Smith's naval guns returned fire with devastating accuracy. British gunners, trained to hit moving targets from rolling ship decks, found static siege positions easy targets. French artillery positions took losses that slowed their bombardment. And when French guns did damage Acre's walls, work parties led by British engineers repaired the damage overnight. Breaches that should have been open for assault were sealed before French infantry could exploit them. Napoleon intensified the bombardment. More guns were brought forward. French batteries fired constantly, day and night, pouring shot into Acre's defences. The walls began to crumble. By early April, sections of wall had collapsed, creating what appeared to be assaultable breaches. Napoleon ordered his first major assault. French infantry advanced in assault columns, the standard formation for storming fortifications. These weren't tentative probes, these were full-scale attacks by veteran soldiers who'd stormed fortresses before. They crossed the killing ground under fire from Acre's walls, reached the breaches, and began climbing over rubble into the fortress. This was the moment that usually decided sieges. Once attackers penetrated fortifications, defenders typically collapsed, but Acre's defenders didn't collapse. Ottoman soldiers and British sailors met the French assault with desperate hand-to-hand fighting. Smith had prepared secondary defences behind the breaches: barricades, position guns, concentrated defenders. French soldiers who fought their way through the breach found themselves in a death trap, taking fire from multiple directions. Smith personally directed defensive fire from the walls, exposing himself to French bullets to coordinate the defence. The British sailors fought with cutlasses and boarding pikes, treating the breach like a ship's deck during boarding action. They pushed the French back through brutal, close combat. The first assault failed. French soldiers retreated with heavy casualties. Napoleon was surprised but not discouraged. Fortress assaults often required multiple attempts. He ordered his engineers to mine under the walls, setting charges that would blow massive breaches the defence couldn't possibly seal quickly. He prepared for a second assault with fresh troops. The second assault came days later, after French mines exploded and created new breaches. Again, French veterans charged forward. Again, they reached the walls and began fighting their way into the fortress. And again, Smith's defence held. Turkish soldiers fought with desperate courage. They knew French treatment of Jaffa's garrison and feared the same fate. British sailors demonstrated the aggressive fighting spirit that made Royal Navy boarding parties legendary. French soldiers, exhausted from crossing the killing ground and climbing rubble under fire, couldn't sustain their momentum once inside the fortress. The assault broke. More French casualties. Another failure. Napoleon refused to give up. His reputation was at stake. The entire Egyptian campaign's success depended on capturing Acre and demonstrating French invincibility. He committed more resources to the siege, more artillery, more ammunition, more assault columns. The bombardment continued relentlessly. By mid-April, sections of Acre's walls were completely demolished. The fortress should have fallen, but Smith kept reinforcing and repairing. British ships brought fresh supplies nightly. Work parties rebuilt collapsed walls with rubble and sandbags. Naval guns repositioned to cover new French approaches. The defence adapted to every French tactic. When Napoleon tried mining operations, Smith's engineers countermined, blowing up French tunnels before they reached the walls. When Napoleon concentrated artillery on specific wall sections, Smith shifted defenders to cover the threatened areas. The British naval officer matched every French move. The siege dragged into late April, and then May. Napoleon launched assault after assault, at least 7 major attacks over the 2-month siege. Each followed the same brutal pattern. French artillery created breaches, French infantry stormed forward, desperate fighting in the ruins of the walls, and ultimately French retreat with heavy losses. French casualties mounted into the thousands. Napoleon's veterans, men who'd conquered Italy and Egypt, were being ground down by this stubborn defence. Morale began affecting the French army. Soldiers who'd believed in Napoleon's invincibility started questioning whether Acre could be taken. The wounded told stories of British naval guns and Turkish fanaticism. Disease spread through French camps. Plague, dysentery, the common afflictions of siege warfare. Napoleon's army, 13,000 strong at the campaign's start, was shrinking from battle losses and sickness. Smith, meanwhile, received reinforcements. Additional Ottoman troops arrived by sea, shipped by British vessels. Fresh supplies kept the defence supplied. The British naval presence prevented Napoleon from receiving any support by sea. His own supply lines stretched overland from Egypt, vulnerable to raids and already inadequate for sustaining a prolonged siege. Time was working against Napoleon. In early May, Napoleon launched his final assault. He committed everything available, artillery preparation more intense than any previous bombardment, elite grenadiers in the assault columns, officers personally leading the attack to inspire the troops. French veterans fought with desperate courage, knowing this might be their last chance. They broke through the walls. They fought deep into the fortress. For hours, the battle raged in the ruins of Acre's fortifications. Smith threw every resource into the defence. Turkish soldiers, British sailors, armed civilians, everyone who could fight was committed to stopping this French assault. The fighting was absolutely brutal. Men fought hand-to-hand in rubble-choked streets. Artillery fired at point-blank range into assault columns. The defence bent, but didn't break. Slowly, incredibly, the French momentum stalled. Smith's defensive positions held. The French assault, having penetrated deep into the fortress, couldn't sustain itself. Exhausted, taking enormous casualties, the French veterans fell back. That was Napoleon's last attempt. On May 20th, after 2 months of siege, Having lost thousands of men to battle and disease, facing the prospect of a much longer siege with dwindling resources, Napoleon made the hardest decision of his career. He ordered the retreat from Acre. Napoleon's withdrawal from Syria was as much a disaster as the siege itself. His army, reduced to fewer than 10,000 effective soldiers, marched south toward Egypt, while being harassed by Ottoman forces and local resistance. French wounded had to be carried or left behind. Napoleon's decision to poison mortally wounded soldiers to prevent their capture remains one of the darkest stains on his reputation. The entire Syrian campaign, which was supposed to secure Egypt and open routes to further eastern conquest, ended in complete failure. When Napoleon finally returned to Egypt, he tried to present the Syrian campaign as a success, claiming he'd defeated Ottoman armies and only withdrawn for strategic reasons. But everyone knew the truth. Acre had stopped Napoleon. For the first time in his career, the great general had been decisively defeated. He'd thrown his army against a fortress and been repulsed. The myth of Napoleonic invincibility was broken. For Britain, Acre represented a different kind of victory. Smith hadn't commanded a large army. He hadn't fought a massive pitched battle. But he'd achieved something enormously important. He'd stopped Napoleon's eastern expansion. By holding Acre, Smith prevented French control of Syria, preserved Ottoman resistance, and forced Napoleon to abandon his grand strategy of marching toward India. British naval power, applied intelligently at a critical point, had strategic consequences far beyond the walls of one fortress. Smith's reputation soared in Britain. He was hailed as the man who defeated Napoleon, a rare distinction in 1799 when French victories dominated European warfare. Parliament thanked him. The press celebrated his achievement. Fellow naval officers praised his tactical brilliance. Even Wellington, years later, acknowledged Smith's accomplishment, recognising that the defence of Acre was a masterpiece of improvised defensive warfare. Napoleon himself acknowledged Smith's role in his defeat. In his memoirs written in exile years later, Napoleon reflected on his career and identified Acre as the turning point of his Egyptian adventure. He specifically credited Smith as the man who frustrated his plans. The famous quote, "That man made me miss my destiny," captures Napoleon's recognition that Smith's defence had derailed his entire Eastern strategy. For a general of Napoleon's ego to admit another officer had bested him speaks volumes about Smith's achievement. The strategic consequences of Acre extended beyond Napoleon's personal defeat. French forces remained trapped in Egypt for another 2 years, increasingly isolated and demoralised. Without the Syrian campaign's success to build on, Napoleon couldn't maintain momentum in the east. When he abandoned his army and returned to France in August 1799 to pursue political power, he left behind a failing campaign. British forces would eventually force French evacuation from Egypt in 1801, ending France's entire eastern adventure. Acre also demonstrated the effectiveness of British naval power applied to land warfare. Smith had taken naval resources, guns, sailors, supplies, mobility, and used them to support a land defence. This wasn't traditional naval warfare, but it showed British flexibility and adaptability. The Royal Navy wasn't just about ship-to-ship battles. It could project power ashore, support Allied forces, and achieve strategic objectives through creative application of naval resources. The siege highlighted another British military virtue, the ability to lead and coordinate multinational forces. Smith commanded Turkish soldiers, British sailors, local militias, and civilian volunteers. He organised this diverse force into an effective defence. This wasn't simply British soldiers following British doctrine. This was coalition warfare, requiring diplomacy, cultural sensitivity, and tactical adaptability. Smith's success at Acre demonstrated British talent for coalition leadership that would prove crucial in the later Napoleonic Wars. For the Ottomans, British assistance at Acre was invaluable. Turkish forces had been retreating before Napoleon's advance, unable to stop French veterans through direct battle. Smith's arrival and naval support turned the tide. The British didn't simply fight for the Ottomans, they enabled Ottoman resistance by providing the resources and leadership that made effective defence possible. This pattern of British support strengthening Allied forces would become characteristic of British strategy throughout the Napoleonic era. The Siege of Acre represents a particular kind of British military excellence. Not the massive set-piece battles like Trafalgar or Waterloo, but the smaller, crucial actions where British ingenuity and determination achieved strategic results. Smith's defence didn't involve tens of thousands of troops or massive casualties. It was a 2-month struggle where one British officer with a few ships and thousands of Allied soldiers stopped the greatest general of the age. This kind of victory, achieved through improvisation, determination, and intelligent use of available resources, reflects distinctly British military virtues. Smith didn't have overwhelming force. He didn't have perfect fortifications or unlimited supplies. What he had was professional competence, tactical flexibility, and absolute confidence that British naval power and skill could overcome French military genius. That confidence was justified. Acre proved that Napoleon could be stopped, that French invincibility was a myth, and that British forces could achieve decisive results even in unexpected theatres of war. The battle also demonstrated British global reach. While European powers focused on continental warfare, British forces operated in the eastern Mediterranean, supporting allies, disrupting enemy operations, and protecting strategic interests. This global perspective and ability to project power worldwide was a key British advantage throughout the Napoleonic Wars. Smith at Acre was just one example of British forces operating far from home, achieving results that affected the entire strategic balance. If this is the kind of military history that interests you, battles won through determination and tactical brilliance, victories that stopped the world's greatest threats, moments when British ingenuity proved decisive, then you know what to do. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered. These are the examples of British excellence that shaped history. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The battles that proved British courage and skill told the way they deserve to be told.